It's going to be very difficult to cover this rather complex topic in 45 minutes, but I will try and do it justice. We're not going to be able to cover every single source in its totality, but it's there for you to take home and read over. So I want to begin with the question. And the question is exactly what is wrong with society today? 45 minutes, the clock's ticking. And I want to begin by saying that where did this title come back? Thanks so much, Joshua. The title originated when Sue asked me for the title a while ago, and I had actually just read an article in the New York Times by someone called David Brooks, who's a journalist in America, journalist, kind of a bit of a philosopher. What was that? Yeah, he wrote the book The Road to Character. And he had actually just written an article where he had looked at the idea of society, which he often does. And he asked the question, how has liberalism failed us? What is it about liberalism that has failed society today? And what he answers essentially, I'm not going to go through the whole article, but his answer is essentially it's not liberalism that's failed us, but it's a certain type of liberalism. And that type of liberalism is what he doesn't necessarily term it this way, but I would call it an individualistic liberalism. That is that liberalism has been taken to a kind of ruthless individualism, which essentially places man at the center. And in doing so, allows us to believe that man's autonomous desires, his autonomous will, which very often means that he's listening really only to his kind of base desires or his trying to satisfy his immediate gratifications. That essentially has been the downfall of liberal society. That's where we've gone wrong. And what he says is if we look back to the Greeks, to the Greek philosophers, when they asked the question, they essentially introduced us in many ways to what liberalism is, democracy, and all the things that we took many years later on. They asked the question, how can we govern society? Where does liberty start? And interestingly enough, even though they did live in quite a hedonistic society, but interestingly enough, a lot of the Greek philosophers, what they essentially taught us was the idea that before a person can govern society, they have to govern themselves. They have to know, they have to be able to discern between what is a higher desire and a lower desire, or a higher value and a lower value. What kind of will am I, which of my wills, which of my desires am I going to listen to, and which is the greater one? And that's essentially, the whole of Greek philosophy is based on this idea of what is the good? What is the good in man? And obviously this is where the discussion starts. And what David Brooks at the time said is that we have essentially released ourselves of the obligatory instincts that we have as human beings, and instead we become, or we serve, our base desires. And that is really a very extreme sense of individualism. And what I want to suggest today is that Pesach is the Chag of Liberty. And I want to ask the question, how does the Torah, from the outset, when we are told about the story of coming out of Mitzrayim, when we're told about the story of the Exodus, how does it give us the tools and how does it give us the starting point through which to view the notion of liberty? And maybe in a way, through learning this or through understanding the Pesach story, we'll be able to see it as an antidote to the decay of liberal society today. So I want to begin with one of the most famous essays by one of the most well-known kind of political philosophers of the last century, Isaiah Berlin. His essay, The Two Concepts of Liberty. And there he outlines for us two different types of liberty. One which he calls negative liberty and one which he calls positive liberty. And he says as follows. The first of these political senses of freedom or liberty, I shall use both words to mean the same, which, following much precedent, I shall call the negative sense, is involved in the answer to the question, what is the area within which the subject, a person or group of persons, is or should be left to do or be what he is able to do or be without interference by other persons. So the idea of negative liberty is the idea of being freed or liberated from any external constraints on my action. Okay? Or interference. The second, which I call the positive sense, is involved in the answer to the question, what or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that? These two questions are clearly different, even though the answers may overlap. I am normally said to be free to the degree with which no man or body of men interferes in my activity. Political liberty in this sense is simply the area within which a man can act unobstructed by others. I'm going to skip to the next paragraph. For it is this, the positive conception of liberty, not freedom from, but freedom to. Have you got this? No. I knew I had done something wrong here. Okay, sorry. Go to the second paragraph. A long way to the positive sense of the word liberty derives from the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master. I wish my life and decisions to depend on myself, not on external forces of whatever kind. I wish to be the instrument of my own, not of other men's acts of will. I wish to be a subject, not an object, to be moved by reasons, by somebody, not nobody, a doer, deciding, not being decided for, self-directed and not acted upon by external nature or by other men, as if I were a thing or an animal or a slave, incapable of playing a human role, that is, of conceiving goals and policies of my own and realizing them. This is at least part of what I mean when I say that I am rational, that it is my reason that distinguishes me as a human being from the rest of the world. And this is the key point. I wish above all to be conscious of myself as a thinking, willing, active being, bearing responsibility for my choices and able to explain them by reference to my own ideas and purposes. I feel free to the degree that I believe this to be true and enslaved to the degree that I am made to realize that it is not. What Isaiah Berlin is setting out for us here is a very important concept, and a concept which, if we look at society today, perhaps explains to us its decay. Negative liberty is what happened when the people came out of Mitzrayim. I am free from the chains or the external constraints that have been placed upon me. Essentially, slavery. I'm free. When I'm asked, negative liberty asks the question, what am I free from? Okay? Positive liberty asks the question, what am I free to? Meaning, if I'm now free from all the external constraints that have been placed upon me, I now have to ask the question, what am I going to do with my freedom? What am I going to use my will to determine? What is my autonomy going to dictate that I do in my life? That's what positive freedom is. And positive freedom allows me to build infrastructures that will cater to me fulfilling the highest level of positive liberty. But, and this is the big B-U-T, and stick with me because I know it's late at night. The big problem is that when I build those infrastructures, and we're going to see what those infrastructures are in a minute, and we're going to see them using a modern theologian, a modern political philosopher, and we're going to see them using the Torah. Those infrastructures are things like, for example, the family, community, religion, tradition. Those infrastructures allow me to build a sense of what I should be using my freedom to do. The problem is with those infrastructures is that sometimes they require me to do things I don't want to do. They sometimes require me to feel obligated. They sometimes require me to say, lo bali, to do that, but yet I know I have a responsibility to do that. Very interestingly enough, a few years ago, I gave a shiur somewhere, and I asked the women there, what do you feel enslaved to today? And there wasn't one woman in that room. There were about 30 or 40 women sitting in that room. And there wasn't one woman in that room, we were very open with each other, that didn't say at some point, their kids, their family, the cooking, the washing, the this, the that. All of us feel enslaved to things that sometimes, that bring us our greatest joy, ultimately, and actually bring us our greatest liberty. Our real liberty, our real positive liberty. But yet there's moments where we feel enslaved to those things. Very often I hear amongst say, when they're talking about Pesach or they're talking about religion, why did God take us out from slavery simply to enslave us again to religion? Okay, but that's misreading it. That is looking at the whole paradigm in or through the lens of Isaiah Berlin's negative liberty. If we want to really understand what Pesach is about, and if we want to really understand what religion is about, we have to look at it through the lens not just of negative liberty, but also of positive liberty. And the very first thing that we are given as slaves that have come out of Egypt is what? What is the first mitzvah? Okay, now for a second let's think. A slave is somebody who has no time. Time means nothing to them. Time is of no essence. Okay, not time of the essence, the total opposite. It's of no essence. But when we are given our negative liberty by God, when He takes us out from the chains of slavery, the very first thing He says to us, and here, by the way, this is it may not be radical for us today, but think about the ancient world, how radical this statement was. A time, by the way, where let's not forget, there was no universal time. There wasn't such a thing as a clock. There wasn't such a thing as time zones and timelines and everyone understanding what time was. And for the first time in the history of mankind, God comes down to a people and says to them, I am giving you the gift of time. The radical notion of the gift of time here is revolutionary. And what he is saying to them here is he is using, or I should say Isaiah Berlin, thousands of years later, is maybe using what God gave, the tool that God gave to the people at the time. He is saying to them, I'm going to give you negative liberty, but I want you to think in terms of positive liberty. You now have this time. You now have this, almost this vacuum, right? I always kind of, being a mother of young kids and some teenagers as well, I always use the analogy of children. I always say, when it comes to Chofesh HaGadol, okay, it's called the Chofesh HaGadol for a reason, because it's enormous, vast amount of time. And the biggest question you have to, and the kids, they come out of school, I'm free. And the biggest question you have to ask yourself, okay, you're free, but now you have so much time in your hands, what are you going to use that time for? Right? You're free, but what is that time going to be used for? This is the statement that Hashem gives over to the people. He says to them, I am now giving you freedom, but what are you going to use that freedom for? And if you're just going to use it to listen to your hedonistic desires, that's not true freedom, because what happens when you do that is essentially you become enslaved again to your hedonistic desires, which is no real freedom at all. Okay? And that is what happens. So in source number 2, V'yom Hashem Moshe ve'al be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor hachodesh hazeh lachem roshei chodeshim rishon hu lachem lechodshei hashana. And the Sephana beautifully says as follows: from now on the months shall be yours, to do with them what you shall desire. For in the times of slavery your days were not yours, they were for serving others in their will. Therefore this month shall be unto you the beginning of months, for this is where your free existence begins. Okay? And this is exactly the idea. This is where our free existence begins. Now I want to take this a step further, and I want us to try and understand here it deserves far more time to develop this idea, but I just want to very, very kind of, in one sentence, try and understand the difference between liberalism and conservatism. Right? Conservatism comes from the word conserve. Okay? And conserve essentially is the idea where I conserve the system of what there is. Okay? I don't need to develop it so much anymore. Okay? And essentially conservatives ground liberty in individual rights. Okay? The rights that I have. Liberalism is much more liberal. Okay? Meaning much more open. And there, liberty is grounded in individual autonomy. But liberalism essentially wants to liberate me in many ways from my obligations, okay, from responsibility sometimes, in its extreme form. Conservatism, in some way, wants to conserve it too much, okay, where there's no change and no growth and no development. So the question is, how do we try to go between the two? And what I want to suggest is taking the paradigm of Isaiah Berlin's negative and positive liberty and taking the idea of the liberal and the conservative society, okay, I want us to try and understand what Pesach gives to us. And what I want to suggest is it gives to us a liberty that is a long road liberty. I'm going to call it a long road liberty. What does that mean? It means it's a liberty that isn't a totally liberal society where I have no responsibilities and no obligations, but it isn't a totally conservative liberty where all I have is rights and I want to conserve everything that is, and the system and the frameworks are all there, but it doesn't matter what they do or provide me just as long as they stay in place. Okay? What the long road liberty is, okay, is where I see the building of society based on the idea that nothing can come overnight. Now, look at two sources in front of you, source number 4 and source number 5. In source number 4, very interestingly, okay, in the Shulchan Aruch, we have Sholim b'Hilchot Pesach Kodem lePesach 30 Yom. Okay, we have to learn about the Hilchot Pesach 30 days before. Okay, why? Why do we need a transitory period of learning about Hilchot Pesach? So one could argue maybe we need to know how to clean, okay, perhaps. There could be many reasons, but what I want to suggest is it's linked very much to a very interesting pasuk, and that's in source number 5. Okay, I brought you only the English. I don't even have the Hebrew here. It came to pass when Paro had let the people go. Hashem didn't lead them through the land of the Philistines. Okay, Eretz HaPlishtim. Even though it was nearer. Mm-hmm. Why do they need to take the long road? Now we know with retrospect that they took the even longer road because it took them 40 years in the desert to get there, okay? But even if they didn't have those 40 years in the desert, which they didn't know at the time, they had to go through the long road. So there's many arguments, and even Pasuk itself says, okay, that the reason why is they weren't ready they didn't want to have to fight a war, and they knew that they were going to fight a war. But there's something here about taking the long road, or the long walk to freedom, okay, as from Nelson Mandela's book, exactly, okay? The long walk to freedom means that I learn something about myself on the journey. And I want to share with you a beautiful essay that I found by someone called Yuval Levine. He's a very well-known American political analyst. He was actually born here in Haifa. He's a public intellectual, academic, a journalist. And he writes, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but he writes here exactly about this idea of the liberation of the individual on the road to liberty. And he says as follows: the liberation of the individual from outside coercion is the short way to liberty, and the way that most progressive and conservatives today seem to have in mind. That is what kind of liberty, according to Isaiah Berlin? Negative liberty. Okay, and that's what most people are seeking today. Why? Because they want the easy way out, right? Because it's easy. If I have no constraints and I have nothing holding me back, then I can do what I want, when I want, with whom I want, and there's no consequences to my action. Okay? The formation of the individual for freedom is the long way. The formation of the individual for freedom is the long way to liberty, and the way that our liberal society plainly requires. The long way is a prerequisite for what the short way promises. It's a necessary preparation. Okay, if we want the short way to liberty, which is an amazing society where everyone gives and everyone's fantastic and I get both my rights and my responsibilities come together, that's great. But you're not going to have that just from negative liberty. That requires a long road. Why does that require a long road? Because it's something that doesn't just have to happen externally. It's something that has to happen internally. And we know it's far easier to take the people out of slavery, to take slavery out of the people. That requires much longer. The long way, but our political instincts now incline us to seek shortcuts. We're tempted to pursue individual liberation without preparation. This leads to an increasingly dangerous failure of self-knowledge. I'm going to go to the long way to liberty. The long way to liberty begins unavoidably with marriage and the family, and the case for the short way begins as a case against their necessity. To live as a father and a husband, a wife and a mother, a child and a sibling, is to live lives shaped by duties and obligations that sometimes great, but often bring joy. That is why the family is best suited to created individuals freely, discharging their responsibilities, the very foundation of any liberal vision of society. Indeed, the family helps us see that freedom ultimately is impossible without responsibility. We can hardly be surprised, therefore, that so many of our culture wars are focused on the family. Okay? The family, according to him, the family is the place where we learn both negative and positive liberty, but we also learn that it's not a quick fix, that it's not a short road, and that it doesn't come, and here's the big word I want to introduce here, it doesn't come without sacrifice. Sacrifice today is a word that has become an anathema to our society. It's a word that we really don't like. Okay? Why? Because it means we have to give up a certain sense of our liberty, okay, or our autonomy, or our will, or our desire. Okay? But sacrifice is also something that made society great. Sacrifice is something that makes us as individuals recognize what real joy is, what real simcha is. And this is exactly what he says to us here. I want to just skip to the last paragraph, second to last paragraph, but this has things backwards. Has everyone got that? Okay, but this has things backwards. Real progress very rarely looks like social transformation. It more frequently looks like personal transformation. Each of us alone is weak and corrupt, but through profound moral exertion and moral formation, we can rise above the dirt and make ourselves a little more noble, more responsible, more decent, more sympathetic, more loving, more free. When the book of Exodus tells us that God did not take his liberated people to the promised land through the land of the Philistines, but opted instead for a longer way through the desert, it also tells us why. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Untutored and unformed, confronted too quickly with the costs and burdens of liberty, they might choose slavery. And we know, by the way, that's exactly what they do. Very often, again and again. And we surprise us, we read it and we say, why do they want to go back to Mitzrayim? What was so great in Mitzrayim? But when the times when they want to return to Mitzrayim, exactly the times when they are faced with the burden of responsibility. Okay, we see it in our kids, we see it in ourselves, right? I always remember I used to get to the front door and I used to have a car full of shopping, and I used to think to myself, oh, I wish my mum was here to carry it in, right? And that's just one stupid example, right? But the example very often we want to go back to our childhood where we didn't have those responsibilities, right? It's a calling that requires us to think about our choices in more than crass terms of utility, and ultimately is a calling that requires us to choose and to help others choose the path of the family, faith, work, learning and community, and to avoid the path of Philistinism, even though it's nearer. Okay, so that's what he says. Now, I want to take this idea of negative and positive liberty of Isaiah Berlin and what Yuval Levine talks about in terms of the idea of liberal society today and how it's decaying in a sense because of the fact that we've forgotten the institutions and we've forgotten the idea of responsibility and sacrifice. And I want us to look at what happens in the story of the Seder story. We begin with a very important thing, and that is the idea of passing, and Oshra said it beautifully, Pesach, the idea of mamash, to talk around a table as a family about our history, about our past, about our narrative. Essentially what Leil HaSeder is about, and I know that for many people Leil HaSeder isn't just talking about the ancient Egypt thousands of years ago, but many families make their own narrative during Leil HaSeder. I know when I was growing up, one of my strongest memories as a child is Leil HaSeder. That's where we make our family narrative as much as anything else. And this is one of the most important things for positive liberty, because I cannot know what to choose. I cannot know what are the right decisions to make as an autonomous, free-willed individual if I do not have the basic groundwork that grounds me. Okay? How do I create that groundwork? Where do those frameworks come from? They come from self-narrative. They come from who am I? Asking questions, who am I? What is my allegiance to my past? What is my allegiance to my present and my future? What is the allegiance I have to my family and my people? That's where self-narrative begins. And we see 3 times, probably more, but 3 times that I found in the message the words that Moshe gives over to the people of Israel. 3 times he says, "V'haya ki amru alechem b'nechem, ma ha'avodah azot lachem, v'amartem zevach pesach hu la'Hashem." Okay? If your children ask you, this is what you tell them. And again, you need to remember to tell your children this. When your son asks you tomorrow, what is this? Part and parcel of being a free person is to know not only that you have an obligation to tell your story to your children, but more than that you have an obligation to tell your story to yourself. That you need to develop a self-narrative, that you need to know who you are and where you come from so that you can give that over to your children. Look at what Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz says in source number 8. Liberation then depends on acquiring an authentic identity, not on rejecting external labor. The meaning of liberation is accepting an authentic system of values, an authentic scale of goals. One who has no identity of his own and no God of his own is bound to always remain a slave, even if his master is not at this moment standing over him. In order to achieve true redemption, and not only an end to exile, it is not enough for the Jewish people to leave the wilderness of the nations. It must also reacquire its own essence, its character, spirit, ways of thinking and ways of life. Only then can it be a nation of free people. In order to make us a free people, it's very easy for Hashem to have taken us out of Mitzrayim and given us negative liberty. That is the easiest step in the exile. The hardest step is exactly what Rabbi Steinsaltz says here at the end, is to allow us to develop an identity, is allow us to develop an essence and a character and a spirit. All of these things require far more than one night. They require a lifetime and more than one generation, because we know the first generation were not ready to go into the land of Israel. It took 2 generations to acquire that, and I would say we're still trying to today as well. We've constantly, we're just coming on the heels of the elections, and we are asking ourselves these questions every single day as a nation. And I think also as individuals, who are we? What is our essence? What's our characteristic? What's our spirit? How much do we take from the past into the future? How much do we take from the past into the present, from the present into the future? How much do we leave behind? Okay, how much do we integrate as part of ourselves? How much do we bring that's new? All of these questions are questions that are part and parcel of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And that is the beginning of liberty. The family is one of the main things that dictates to us what positive liberty or how positive liberty should look. The second thing that dictates to us how positive liberty should look is the notion of sacrifice. And I want to read with you Rabbi Abraham Yeshua Heschel, and he says as follows: "We all share devotion to the hard-won freedoms of the American people. Yet to be worthy of retaining our freedoms, we must not lose our understanding of the essential nature of freedom. Freedom means more than mere emancipation. It's primarily freedom of conscience, bound up with inner allegiance. The danger begins when freedom is thought to consist in the fact that I can act as I desire. This definition not only overlooks the compulsions which often lie behind our desires, it reveals the tragic truth that freedom may develop within itself the seeds of its own destruction." Now, Heschel was writing when? In the 1960s, okay? He was writing in the 1960s, that was almost 60 years ago, Okay, he couldn't have predicted more than what's happening today. Okay, which is exactly this idea that the freedom, the seed of its own destruction lies in freedom itself, and that is exactly the malaise of what's happening in liberal society. He continues and he says, freedom is the liberation from the tyranny of the self-centered ego. It comes about in moments of transcending the self as an act of spiritual ecstasy, of stepping out of the confining framework of routine reflexive concern. Freedom presupposes the capacity for sacrifice. Okay? And then he continues, I'm not going to read it. Okay? I want us to look now at what I see really, as much as the Seder story, as much as the exile story is the paradigm for liberty, there's one particular part of it that I see really as the climax of that moment, and that is the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach is, in every way, integrates exactly these notions of what everyone we've seen until now talks about, the idea of family and the idea of sacrifice. These two main ideas. Have a look at the Korban Pesach. Have a look at what the Torah tells us about the Korban Pesach. Oh, do you have it in Hebrew? No? Okay. Hold on a second. Okay, so speak to the congregation of Israel. Every person has to take a lamb according to the father's house, according to their households. And what happens if you don't have anyone in your house? If he doesn't have, okay, if the household's too little, he needs to go and eat the Korban Pesach with who? With his neighbor. Meaning what? Not one person here eats alone. There is no solitary confinement, there's no solitary consumption, okay, when it comes to the Korban Pesach, okay? This is not what I call an enslaved liberalism. This is a liberalism that already is creating the groundwork for positive liberty. It begins with negative liberty. We have to be taken out of the chains that we've been enslaved for our Egyptian taskmasters for so many years. But it's not just that. Hashem is already laying the groundwork and laying all the tools in place so that we can develop positive liberty. And the very first two things given to us, time, and the second, the importance of family, of eating together. Now, as slaves for hundreds of years, when they got food, they ate. No one thought about eating with somebody else. Okay, that wasn't even in their mindset. Therefore, the very first thing they're told to do is do not eat alone. Because when you sit round the table, there's a great book by someone called Thomas Friedman, also a very well-known journalist, political scientist, whatever, in America, called Thanks for Being Late. And there he talks all about society today and obviously everything that's wrong. And one of the things he says is that in companies today they found that all these Zoom meetings and everything else, they're all great, but when it comes to having to make a decision, he says the only way to do it is round the dining room table. Okay, round the dining room table, meaning when you are sitting face to face with somebody and talking to them. That, you can do everything over the camera, but that really is where everything happens. And we know that. We know Shabbat, we know Chagim, we know that is where nowadays in the week everyone's eating at different times and running here and running there. But Shabbat is the time when we're around the dining room table, and that's exactly what they're saying here. That's where liberty, that's where you feel the joy of all the sacrifices and obligations and responsibilities. The moment you feel it's all worth it, the moment you really feel that liberation is when you're sitting around the dining room table. That's where it happens, and that is the beginning of Pesach. That is the beginning of liberty. Saying that there are things, it's not just anymore about eating when you want to eat, the minute you get to eat. It's about thinking about the long term. It's about thinking, what do I give up? What do I become obligated to? What responsibilities do I take on in order to build for myself a life and a society that is going to function to create real, true liberty when I'm not enslaved to my base instincts and desires and things that I want in the immediate, right? Immediate gratification, but for the long term. And that's where it begins. And more than that, what's really interesting is that what do they have to do? They have to take this lamb, okay, and they have to keep it till the 14th day, okay, so they have to keep it for 4 days, okay, and then On the 14th day, they have to sacrifice it at dusk. Why at dusk? What is dusk in ancient Egypt? Rush hour. Dusk is rush hour. So not only do they have to hold this god of the Egyptians, because that's what the lamb was, the god of the Egyptians, they have to tie it up, they have to keep it, then they have to sacrifice it in front of their taskmasters, their god, at dusk when everyone's rushing home, and just in case the taskmasters didn't see them do it, Hashem then tells them, you're not allowed to cook it in a pot where no one can see you doing. You've got to cook it whole, roasted, everything out there, not cut up so you don't know what it is, on a spit, on a fire, so everybody can see what you are doing. Again, this is part of negative liberty, but it's also part of positive liberty. On the one hand, it's God saying to them, I'm going to liberate you from your taskmasters, but it's also God saying to the people, you have to liberate yourself as well. You have to allow yourself to set yourself free. It's not something that I can just do for you. You have to do it yourself. And then you have to eat it and not leave anything until the morning. Why nothing until the morning? You have to have faith that tomorrow, because we know slaves always kept a bit over. You have to have faith tomorrow, you're going to have another meal from God. And that is the beginning. Faith, family, being able to move away from the chains, from the yokes that have enslaved you for so long. These are all the things that keep us, that create positive liberty. And obviously the whole thing that is actually called Korban Pesach, the sacrifice of Pesach. Sacrifice is one of those things that is immensely important. And what's fascinating is that Rashi, on the words V'haya lachem lemishmeret, on the words that it should be for you as a holding, meaning you have to keep it for those 4 days, he brings a very interesting midrash. And there, essentially what he says is that there were two, we know the pasuk, B'tzmai chayech, B'tzmai chayech, and through your blood you shall live. There's two, the people were not ready to come out of Egypt. They had reached the lowest level of tum'ah, the lowest level of impurity. And in order for them to come out of Egypt, Hashem says, I have to give them 2 mitzvot that they have to do. What are those 2 mitzvot? Korban Pesach and Brit Milah. Okay? Why have they got to be given? Why can Hashem not just take them out of Egypt? Why do they have to start sacrificing the lamb, putting the blood on the doorpost, doing Brit Milah, all of these things? Because when I invest something, I become part of it. When I invest in my family, I become part of it. And we know nowadays, everyone says, give your children things to do at home, even if you have a cleaner every day. Give your children tasks to do at home because it makes them feel that they are invested in the family. That is part and parcel of being part of a covenant. A covenant means that there are 2 partners and both partners take responsibility. When Hashem gives us Brit Milah and when Hashem gives us Korban Pesach, what he is saying to us is, I'm God, I can do whatever. I can take you out tomorrow, you don't need to do anything. But I'm asking you to do this because liberation is not just something that comes from an external release of bondage. It's something that you have to work on. It's a long journey. It's not something short. And I know we're kind of short of time, and I want to finish here by talking about what really is the antidote to the decay of liberal society. And I want to begin by showing you a very interesting pasuk. Okay, the pasuk is in Dvarim. And there, if you just look at pasuk Yud Daled, in that pasuk, Moshe says to people just before they're about to go into land, I'm warning you that you're going to get into the land, and in the land you are going to become victims of enslaved liberalism. Okay? Meaning what? You are going to build beautiful houses, you're going to have so much money, you're going to reap your crops, everything's going to be great, okay? And you're going to forget God. Okay? Kesef v'zahab yobelacha, you're going to have so much money, you're going to have these amazing houses, batim tovim tivneh v'yashavtem, you're going to dwell in them, everything's going to be fab. Okay? But the only problem is, right, v'ram levavcha, you're going to become haughty, you're going to become filled with hubris. And what? You're going to forget Hashem. Why specifically here does Hashem say you're going to forget the God that took you out of Egypt? Because God gave you liberty. But He gave it to you for a purpose. He didn't give it to you for hedonistic living. He gave it for you yes, to live well. That's part and parcel of being a human being. You need to be comfortable and live well. But ultimately, He gave it to you to remember the higher values in life. And what's fascinating is when Moshe turns to people, he says something. He says, if you look at Pasuk Tet Vav, he says, remember that I took you through the Midbar, Tet Zayin, right? And I fed you in the Midbar, okay, that your forefathers hadn't known. Leman anotecha or leman nisotecha lehetivcha ba'acharitecha. Okay, he says, I afflicted you and tested you so that it would be good for you. Now, ba'acharitecha can be read as how is it usually read? In the end, right? So it would be good for you in the end. Okay, but it also comes from the word achrayut, right? Meaning what? All of this coming out of exile, coming through, being tested in the desert and going through the long road to freedom. All of those tests and all of everything you went through was why? So that it would be good for you, because so that you can take responsibility. That in the end, it comes down to you taking responsibility. It's not just about what I've given you. It's not just asking about what can the world give to me. It's also about me asking, what can I give to the world? And what is so beautiful, and certainly one of my favorite narratives of the whole of Sefer Devarim, is when in Parashat Ki Tavo, when they come to the land of Israel, they're told, come to the land. It's the first thing we're told about coming to the land. Not set up a society, not look for political parties to vote for, okay, not set to get democratic state. The very first thing we're told to do when we come to the land of Israel is to what? Is to bring your first fruits up to the Beit HaMikdash. That is a strange mitzvah. And yet it's everything. Because when we bring the first fruits, what we are essentially saying is we are creating exactly this idea, an antidote to the decay of liberal society. Because we are saying, these first fruits that I have taken from my field, that I have grown, that I have invested in, okay, I want to take them to my house and I want to eat them. I want to do solitary consumption. Okay, that's what I want to do. And yet the Torah demands that I take them up to the Beit HaMikdash. And when I go up there, I say what I say in the Haggadah, which is the whole of Magid, which is Armi Oved Avi. That is the whole of Magid. This is where it begins. It begins here. And we turn around, and the farmer turns around and he says, this is my narrative. This is my story. This is what I'm going to tell my children and my grandchildren and myself and all the future generations. I have come to the land for a bigger reason. It's not just about going to the canyon and buying my shopping, because that's important too, especially Erev Pesach. Okay? But it's much more than that. It's about knowing why I'm going to the canyon to do my shopping. It's about knowing why I'm in this land. And more than that, and this is the beautiful part of it all, at the very end, once he said all of the pasuk of where he is, who he is, and he's now today the farmer in the land of Israel, bringing his fruit up to the Beit HaMikdash, the Torah then says to us, pasuk Yud Aleph, ושמחת בכל הטוב אשר נתן לך השם אלוקיך ולביתך אתה והלוי והגר אשר בקרבך. The only way you can achieve true happiness, true liberty, is when you share what you have with those that are less than you, with the ger and almanah, with the stranger, and with the Levites, and with the people that don't have what you have. That's where you find true simcha. That's where you find true joy. And I want to just finish with literally two last sources. One is David Brooks and one is Jonathan Sacks. David Brooks says as follows: this is what Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom. When the external constraints are loosened, when a person can do what he wants, when there are sounds and choices and distractions, then life can lose coherence and direction if there isn't a strong internal structure. You have to give to receive. You have to surrender to something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to conquer your desire to get what you crave. If you don't develop a coherent character in this way, life will fall to pieces sooner or later. You will become a slave to your passions. And if you do behave with habitual self-discipline, you will become constant and dependable. The things that lead us astray are short-term: lust, fear, vanity, gluttony. The things we call character endure over the long term: courage, honesty, humility. People with character are capable of a long obedience in the same direction, of staying attached to people and causes and callings consistently through thick and thin. People with character also have scope. They are not infinitely flexible, free-floating and solitary. They are anchored by permanent attachments to important things. In the realm of the intellect, they have a set of permanent convictions about fundamental truths. In the realm of emotion, they are enmeshed in a web of unconditional love. In the realm of action, they have a permanent commitment to tasks that cannot be completed in a single lifetime. And that exactly is Judaism. The notion of Mashiach, the idea of Tikkun Olam. We all know that's not something that we in our lifetimes, we like to hope, okay, but that's not something we in our lifetimes are able to do. And yet, we all still do it. Why? Because that is the long road to liberty. Liberty means being attached to something bigger than myself, knowing that I may not achieve it, but the next generation will, if I have implanted within them all the values in the system that will allow them to continue on that road to liberty. And I finish with Jonathan Sachs, who beautifully brings for us the idea of the movement between Pesach and Shavuot. And he says, that, therefore, is the journey of the counting of the Omer. The counting of the Omer represents from Chofesh, the negative freedom of Pesach, and the release from slavery, to Chayrut, the substantive freedom of covenant and the revelation of Mount Sinai. Freedom means more than losing your chains. It involves developing the capacity to think, feel, and act for the benefit of others. That needs families and schools and places of worship, conversations between generations, rituals, prayers, and the telling of stories. It needs habits of the heart, and it takes time, which is why between Pesach and Shavuot we become conscious of time by counting days. Pesach is the beginning of the journey, not the end. To win freedom is one thing, to sustain it another. Judaism taught this truth in the simplest of ways, by counting the days between Pesach and Shavuot, Exodus and Revelation. Freedom begins with the defeat of tyranny, but is preserved by a code of virtue. The Torah, Israel's constitution of liberty, which lies beyond the realm of democratic vote, individual preferences, or passing fashion. Judaism early sages asked, who is mighty? They answered, not the one who is strong enough to defeat his opponents, but the one who is strong enough to practice self-restraint. Moral virtue needs a different and more difficult strength than military courage. That is what we learn on the journey from Pesach to Shavuot, from individual to covenantal freedom. I wish you all a Chag Kasher Pesach V'Sameach, and enjoy.